Oh, hi. Hello, nerds. Welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am that host of yours, that woman who rants and rambles and lives her entire life for ancient Greek history and mythology, Liv. And I am back today with a new conversation episode. This one is so interesting. Again, as you will hear me say 10,000 times. So back in March, I spoke with Justin Lorenzo Biggi, who studies, well, so many things, as they will tell you in the episode. But in this case, we're talking Athenian citizenship and how that intersects with disability and Athenian myths and notions of autochthony, which is how they understood basically indigeneity, being born of the land. We also talk a lot about generally studying the ancient world, ancient sourcing, ancient languages, so much. It was very fun, and you all know I will take any excuse to use the word autochthony. This episode is very heavy on the history in a great way, but also how that intersected with mythology. But like I said, Justin also shares a lot about disability in ancient Athens and what that meant for people, like how being a citizen affected one's life even more distinctly if they were disabled. It is absolutely fascinating, and I learned so much all over again listening before posting it, because again, we recorded it back in March. So huge thank you to Justin for coming on and for dealing with my ability to say, "Oh, that's so interesting," and only "Oh, that's so interesting," after almost every statement. One of these days, my conversation vocabulary will move beyond that word, but that day is not today. Conversations, textual ghosts, the intersection of Athenian autochthony and disability with Justin Lorenzo Biggi. Yeah, so tell me what you study. Tell me kind of what the thing is that you wanted to share on the show.
Okay, so I study a lot of, I kind of consider myself a bit of a jack of all trades. So all three of my sort of theses slash dissertations that I have done or will do have been like wildly different in topic. So for my BA, my dissertation for my BA was on Plato and the Neoplatonists and St. Augustine and language theory.
Ooh.
And then I got, so I have ADHD, so I got bored with that.
Same. Yeah, don't worry. That's why I cover literally everything on this show all the time.
I was like, no, thank you. And then I pivoted, switched over, found a niche, and then started doing the same thing in my niche. So I found my niche, and the niche was epigraphy and inscriptions. And so I did my master's dissertation that was on autochthony and the myth of autochthony and sort of the creation of a unified Athenian identity. And I analyzed that through funerary inscription.
Ooh.
And then my poor supervisor, he was like, well, you see, for a PhD project, we usually take, stuff that you've introduced in your master's, and then you write your proposal and you expand on that. And I was like, no, that is boring. What I want to do is keep the epigraphy side of things and the citizen identity side of things, but I want to talk about disability. And so my PhD, which I'm in the process of, going like, hello, please, just at various universities, as one does.
It sounds like that's what
is
getting a PhD is, or starting one at least, is like,
mhm,
who will take me? Who will give me
hello.
money for it?
Yes, money please, money please. That's the most important part. So, three very different topics with sort of the guiding principle of what language use and what we do with language tells us about, who the ancients were.
Mhm.
And so I think, I think as far as sort of talking about myths and talking about mythology, there's a lot that can be said about autochthony, which I'm sure you're very happy to hear. Yeah, so the way that,
Always.
uh-huh. So what I looked at in my master's dissertation, what I looked at in that part of what I do research on is basically, what language do the Athenians use when they speak about themselves and when they speak about each other? And what mythology is that drawing from? What is the mythology that is being used to express identity? How does that reflect in funerary inscriptions? And I chose
Mhm.
funerary inscriptions because I find it really interesting how the overlap between body and object is so strong, and the representation of the physical body, because you get, especially in private slash personal funerary monuments, you get, actual representations of the deceased. And then the inscriptions come in and give context to those representations. And these contexts are built on this common ground of, all these tightly woven, I call them networks of meaning, because you get references to, for example, one of my favorite monuments is the grave stele of Amphitrite, who is an older woman. She's a grandmother, and she's holding her grandchild. And in the inscription itself, what we get is pretty straightforward. The inscription is just like, I hold the beloved child of my daughter the same way as I did when we were alive, now that we're both
Oh.
dead. So it's very touching. It's very simple. But then you sort of crack under the surface and you get all these like meanings. So, okay, what does this tell us? Well, for example, it's very rare, older women aren't very much accounted for. Older age in general is understudied in the ancient world just because most of the references we do get to older people are in plays. They're in comedies, they're archetypes in comedies and drama. But then a connection that I drew was between the fact that, well, older women also represent something particular when it comes to the household, because they're kind of in this in between space where they're no longer women, they're no longer of marriable age, but they still represent the continuation of the household.
Mm.
And on that monument in particular, we get, sort of the three generations, the interaction of the three generations, because there's the grandmother, the grandchild, but then there's also, the mother in between, and that connection's made clear. And so what does that tell us about the structure of the household? What does that tell us about the role of women in the household? And, for example, we don't have that many references to older women, but what we do have is, to sort of bring it back to the mythological theme, we do get, the Homeric hymn to Demeter.
Mhm.
And in that text, Demeter, in her search for Persephone, she disguises herself as an older woman, and then the reader and the author or authors sort of have the chance to explore that side of things. And it's not an explicit connection, but my argument is that it's there, and it's part of sort of the mythological makeup that gives importance to these funerary documents.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I mean, Demeter is sort of the most iconic mother of Greek myth anyway. And then, so yeah, in that hymn, when we have her disguised and caring for a baby in that disguise, like she kind of uses that as a way to be a mother again while she's looking for Persephone.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's also I mean, putting the kid in the fire thing, not ideal for the mother, but maybe unrelated here. But I do always love that scene of, why are you angry? I'm just helping him. But that is really interesting, yeah, and kind of looking at that. Of course, the thing I talk about most is what is the role of women, but also what do we not know about women of the ancient world because of things that are lost or missing. So that's extra. I mean, that's just interesting also to see like a depiction of somebody holding their grandchild, but then also mentioning the child in between and having those generations there. That's very lovely. Is that in Kerameikos?
Yes.
I realize I'm not being clear to my listeners, but Kerameikos is the ancient Athenian like cemetery that you can visit, and it's pretty incredible. That's where I saw this pomegranate that was still on the tree but had split open completely and was like open and broken and curled and hanging down but like still attached to the tree. And it was one of the I just somehow just fell completely in love with this like one physical pomegranate in an
Yeah.
ancient cemetery because it just could not have symbolized more.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing. I love it when things like that happen. When just like the pieces fall into place slightly too perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. Like I ended up getting it tattooed on me, I'll be honest.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, it's like it's those moments where you're just like, oh yes, perhaps there is magic.
Right?
You know?
And yeah, I mean, and to dive deeply into an unrelated kind of sort of, well, I suppose him to Demeter not unrelated, but to me it's like the best way for me to get something for Persephone that doesn't feel like it's on like giving this idea of a consensual relationship to Hades, where I'm like, no, this is like a pomegranate saying no to the
Yeah, this is
underworld kind
like
of thing.
complicated and nuanced as that
Yeah,
relationship was always represented.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. Somehow that's like the only thing I remember from Karameikos, other than obviously it was all very beautiful, but this pomegranate's like in my head for life.
Yeah, I don't know. I find and here's the 14-year-old goth in me sort of still jumping out. I find cemeteries a very sort of peaceful place.
I mean,
Yeah.
as a 14-year-old punk, to with goth friends, but I
Mm,
was very strongly the punk, but I get it completely. Like we used to just go like we have this super spooky cemetery here in Victoria and used to go just I don't know, let's just go wander it. That just seems like the best place to be, absolutely. In between our punk shows. It was nearby.
exactly. Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I don't know. I just find it like not even spooky. I just think that cemeteries are just such a thoughtful place and such a kind of, you go in good. You're if you're in a cemetery, you're always in good company.
It's very true and very peaceful. It's
Hmm.
certainly quiet. Yeah.
Yeah.
We also found figs in this Carmichael cemetery and ate them. And I was like, this is just I'm just having so much fun with like all of the
Yeah. Yeah.
surrounding things.
Living. Yeah. No, I mean, and that's funny because like something else that I'm really passionate about, and I try to, and this is more passionate like on my own, but like sort of try to bring into my research work as well is just this idea of like space as an sort of an active participant. An
Mm,
urban space as an active participant in the way that identity develops and citizen identity develops, which is where sort of disability becomes so interesting as
mhm.
well because and I haven't properly started research on this topic again because I am in academia purgatory. I'm just floating. I'm not. I'm doing too many things, and I keep on telling people like I'm really happy that I took some time off in between my master's and my PhD. Because like that way I can rediscover who I am without academia. And then I'm doing 25 things, and they're all academic things because can't stay away.
I mean, as someone who started this career being like, this is not academic. I'm not an academic, which like still I'm not, but I'm like, well, but now I just talk to academics constantly and kind of I'm thinking of how could I find the time to go do my MA amidst all of this when in reality I'm probably like doing the equivalent of an MA like at least
Basically, yeah,
twice a year.
yeah, exactly, just by listening to just by throwing the pumpkin into the enclosure.
Exactly. But I am so curious about how and we'll see how I edit this together because of this, but I am so curious how you're figuring disability, studying disability in with these topics. So, I mean, even if
Yes.
it's not something you have, started too deep, but I want to hear,
Oh
what
my
the
gosh.
basis is. Yeah.
Yeah. So the basis is twofold. One is I am disabled in a multifaceted way, and my own disability has been central to the way in which I relate to the classics. So I was diagnosed with a seizure disorder in high school, and I grew up in Italy. And so the way that Italian high school works is you basically pick a specialization at like 14.
Wow.
And then you have like 2 years of wiggle room, but by the start of your third year, you're pretty much locked in. And what I was voluntold was that the classics specialization would have been really great and would have probably fit me really well. And 2 years, so first 2 years of my high school career, and I think I think it's really important to be really open about this kind of stuff because, knocking the ivory tower from the inside is, I think, my aspiration and that of many others is the fact that, so I almost failed ancient Greek and Latin basically through my entire high school career. Every single time I'd basically get by the skin of my teeth. It was dreadful. I thought about switching a million times. I continued, and so in the first 2 years of high school, I had surgery multiple times. Was in a wheelchair for a good month and a half each time. So was basically relearning my own body, while also coming face to face with concepts that I had never experienced before. Like all the eris, and it sounds sort of cheesy, but it is very much true that I was relearning my body and I was learning this new thing, and it was all about kind of structure and physicality and verbs and language kind of translating into how I needed to reassess myself.
Hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
I love it. I just yeah. And so
Yeah.
it was
Just
you
to
know
offer a similar thing, the worst grades I ever got in university were in Greek mythology. Because it's like, sometimes your brain doesn't do the thing the way the class wants you to do the thing. And that doesn't mean you're not good at the thing,
No,
you know?
exactly. And that's actually what happened. So I first 2 years of high school surgery, physical, like needing to relearn my body both physically and like having to sort of adapt to these new challenges, learning this new thing, struggling because of course, as a lot of undiagnosed neurodivergent kids, you might thrive for a while in an academic environment, and then you hit the first roadblock, and it's like all of the little coping mechanisms and all of the sort of the structure that you've created crumbles, and then because there's little to no support, you have no way of building that back up again. So then I was also diagnosed with a seizure disorder in my third year, and that was much more complicated than just the surgery because high school is hell, and
Yeah, it's hard
high
enough.
school is hell. High school is hard enough, and then there was I had to navigate a lot of ableism because of the seizures. But I was navigating all of this while also, as I mentioned, like struggling very much with ancient Greek, with Latin, sort of the two kind of central courses. And everyone was like, what are you doing?" When I announced by, my fourth year that I really wanted to continue doing this into university. And so I grew up in Italy, but my mom's from the States. And so I sort of always lived in between the two countries, but I wanted to try to live like for a longer period of time in the US just to see how it was. And so I decided that I wanted to do my undergrad in the US. I was very generously awarded a scholarship that allowed me to do this, but I'll forever remember the Latin teacher that I had my last year of high school saying, "Oh, you're going to the States? Oh, that's fine. You'll be fine because it's easier there."
Ugh.
Yeah, yeah. Which opens a whole other thing about Italian, like sort of the Italian school system, which is not the kind of worms we are here to unearth. Um, but then two things happened. So I went to the U.S. I started my, BA Ancient Greek, and I thrived.
Hmm.
Like I mean, the first year was tough because the first year I spent most of the first year being like, I am a fraud. I have tricked them all. Soon they will discover my fraudulent schemes. That's imposter syndrome, which is what
Oh yeah.
a lot of us a lot of us struggle with.
I mean, all the time, literally all the time.
All the time. But I
I
was
still don't know Greek or Latin, and like, the
that's
imposter
okay.
syndrome is there. I
Yeah,
know,
of course. Well,
you
also because
know.
we think that the languages are the be all end all. Like you can't
Yes.
progress this without the languages, and it's like false,
Well, and I didn't learn that until like
incorrect.
recently. I have a classics degree where no one during the course of my entire degree ever said that Greek and Latin are vital to the further learning of classics. And I'm just like, how does that get away? How do they get away with like not telling you that when you're doing a physical classics degree? And then I hear later like, oh no, it's like if you don't know the languages, you're not at all a classicist. And it's like,
Yeah, I
okay,
mean, even
well,
now, even now when I'm applying for, as I've been applying for PhD programs, a lot of the feedback that I've gotten is like, because maybe like, you've got word limits. I don't mention, there's always, I might not mention, oh, I know both Greek and Latin, but then a lot of the feedback that I've been getting from like potential supervisors have been like, oh no, you have to make sure that you mention that. They
gosh.
want to know, they want to see that you know it. And I'm like, first off, would my work be any less valuable? You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
just, yeah, would my work be any less if I had continued to struggle in my undergrad with ancient Greek and Latin and not done them and still continued to study the classics? you know it's having been sort of on both sides of, I really struggled with this
Mm-hmm.
for so long, I hated it, and then also having been on the side of like, well, actually this is fantastic. You don't need them. Some of the most intelligent classicists I know, did the languages, tried them out, and not intelligent, that's not the word I want to use, but
Mm.
some of the most nuanced and capable and, you know, really impressive classicists that I know took the languages for a year and then we're like, nah. And it's one of the things that just fills me with joy is seeing how more and more we're moving away from the languages as an absolute paradigm, as a marker of, worthiness of your scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it just is such a gatekeepy thing.
No, yeah, exactly. But it's so ingrained in the way that the discipline is taught, and it's so ingrained in the way that people view the discipline that it doesn't. It's there, and you should know it. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't, it's your personal failure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
Mm-hmm.
I find it very frustrating because again, as having been sort of on both sides of that, it's just like, well, the alternate universe me that never got into it, never found the knack for it. I don't think that their scholarship would be any less valuable than the current universe version of me. You know. Um, but yeah, so basically, I came to my undergrad entirely different environment, and I think it was I think it was both, you know, finding my footing with something that had impacted my self esteem for so long, and then also for the first time in my life not experiencing ableism when it came to something that I felt so vulnerable about, which was my seizures.
Mm-hmm.
And so those two things combined. So there's always been a very strong undercurrent of me growing as a scholar in my own personal journey, and me growing in my own personal journey of self acceptance. So it's always been in the back of my mind. It's always been there.
Mm-hmm.
And studying inscriptions for my master's and seeing that actually is what made it click in my head that I could approach that, there's these objects that combine both the physical and the written word in a way that not many other things do. We have votives that do that as well, but votives count as a type of inscription if
Mm-hmm.
if there's writing on them. I almost said votives count as a type of inscription if they're inscribed, and that would have been terrible. Um, but
I mean, not
yeah,
wrong though.
not wrong, not incorrect, just like bad. Um, yeah, and so studying inscriptions, studying, the written object that connects the physical to the more kind of intellectual side of things, and then saying, well, but there's so much disability theory that talks about embodiment, and there's incredible work that's being done, about sort of disability in the ancient world, about what does it mean um, to embody, and what does it mean to talk about embodying or talk about bodies in the context of, a time that we no longer have direct access to,
Mm-hmm.
and a time that we, seek to reconstruct, whether it's, by, studying the pigments on statues, by historical reconstruction in movies. There's always this grasping for the physical in the ancient world, but it's always such a, finally now not as white, but was very white for a very long period of time. But then it's always been such a, reconstructed. It's always been so non-disabled,
Mm-hmm.
and the spaces have never been read as disabled. In the last 10 years, we've begun to sort of look at ancient space and say, well, actually, maybe not. Maybe there's more to it. And so that whole big convoluted sort of mess of feelings is what pushed me to want to study disability in the ancient world.
Mm-hmm. Classics Twitter has really opened my eyes to the fact that that's like a field of study and there's just so much there. It's been really interesting and I'm very grateful for the people that are on there and sharing that stuff because I don't think I certainly had no idea before, that like not only is it something that you can study, but there's just so much there. There's
Yes.
so much there to be studied.
And there's so much there to be studied. I think it also really benefits from just it's the same with studying race in the ancient world or gender in the ancient world. It's sort of the intersectionality becoming undeniable.
Mm.
It's it's important because it says, well, actually, no, you cannot study one without the other. So a text that it has been studied to death, but a paper that I am currently working on is there's this speech by Lysias it's very famous. It's one of his most famous. Lysias 24, and it's about this disabled man who is arguing that he should be allowed to receive his disability pension.
Hmm.
And it's been used, a lot of the scholarship has been mostly about the economic side of things.
Right.
Which is totally fine, perfectly interesting. But if you open those articles, if you read those articles, very little is done. It's sort of the disabilities has very often been a bit of an afterthought, a bit of a footnote.
Mm-hmm.
It's been like, oh yeah, and then he's also disabled. And I've been looking. I haven't found it yet. If it exists, and anyone is listening, please, and you have written the paper that does that, please send it my way. I would absolutely love to read it. But I haven't found a paper yet that says, yes, this person is poor. This person needs to rely on government support, but this person is also disabled. And those two things are connected because this person is receiving economic support specifically because of their disability.
Mm-hmm.
And I still haven't found the paper that looks at that.
Interesting, because obviously it depends on how you describe it to me, but like that sounds like it's completely obvious that should be sort of an equal part of studying that because, especially because if it proves or shows that the government was providing assistance for people with disabilities, like I think that alone is so fascinating. Let alone the disability or the economic side, but just the fact of that I think is really interesting in itself. Is this Athenian? I assume.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is. Which also opens a bit of another can of worms when you look at sort of citizenship. So that's the other big side of the things
Mm.
that I look at is I look at citizenship.
Hmm.
In particular, I look at how citizenship is expressed and how, in the case of funerary inscriptions, especially, sort of mythology comes into play with that. But with disability, it's so much of citizenship is wrapped up in this idea of kind of honor, of doing things that are worthy of honor,
Mm.
um, and that therefore make so you do an act, and that act is honorable, and therefore you are worthy of honor. So it sort of becomes a kind of a self-sustaining system. And then in
Mm-hmm.
Athens, you add in the fact that autochthony is a thing. And so if you're a citizen, you are inherently worthy of time, of honor, because you're a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like if you're a citizen, so citizenship is maintained, yes, by birth and by blood, but it's also maintained through actions and through the things that you do. So if you're a citizen, if you're an Athenian citizen, okay. If you're a male Athenian citizen, okay, you have to participate in politics. What does it mean if you can't? What does it mean if you can't? In Athens, because there's this idea of inherent citizenship, then you get systems of support, and then you get
Hmm.
mechanisms of support. And that's interesting because if you compare it, for example, with other places like Sparta, where citizenship isn't as inherently defined, there isn't some big overarching mythological reasoning of, well, we've codified the genetic element, of this myth. We've all we're autochthonous. We
Mm-hmm.
either, and of course, it's one of the autochthonous as a term is one of those terms that is hotly debated, because either it means we came from the earth, so we were born from it, so we are all descendants of Erichthonius, who had his little snake legs and then came out of the earth, and they put him in the basket, and so on and so forth. Or, which is the more practical side of it, it's we were always here. We didn't come from anywhere else. Athenians were always here. We started here. We didn't emigrate. We didn't immigrate. Um, but because Athens has that, then you get all these interesting developments where, yes, citizenship, you have to do things to maintain your citizenship, but then your citizenship is also maintained inherently by who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens when you throw disability into the mix? What happens when in a system where you have to perform citizenship, or you have to perform the duties of citizenship, but you can't because you're disabled? Well, then here you have this mechanism that ensures that you don't have to renounce your citizen status.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Does any of it apply to women? I'm assuming not.
It depends on. I mean, do you mean citizen women?
So what tell me about citizen women. What constituted women becoming citizens or being citizens in Athens? Because I feel like I don't know enough about that generally.
Well, I mean, the first thing is birth.
Yeah. So they
So,
were official citizens?
what is a citizen? Oh,
Right.
Liv.
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
here we go.
please though. Yeah.
Oh
Because
boy.
I'm always interested in this because I know like we know most about Athenian women because they wrote everything down and kept it, or we kept it, or what have you. But also that like that kind of gives us this interesting and somewhat flawed idea of women in the Greek world generally because
I'm
Athenian women are so unique. But please, like I mean, and I
I'm
don't,
just I'm
the
just
history's not good
laughing.
at. Yeah,
I'm just laughing because they're like, what is a citizen? So a lot of work
yeah.
has. So it's like, okay, so you're sort of your ideal. And here comes the Platonist in me. Sometimes he's still in there somewhere, just rattling the bars of the cage, screaming, being like, "You did all this work," and I'm like, "Get out!" But yeah, so what is a citizen? Okay, so a citizen is an adult male, because that's the definition that we've always sort of had, the polites.
hmm
It's the adult male body, and they're the ones who go to court and do all the politics stuff. And it's like, okay, but then the counter argument to that, and it's been presented in many different ways by many different scholars, but there has been a very real push to say, well, okay, actually, it wasn't. It's like the man goes out and does the politics, and then the women stay inside and don't do the politics, and that's how it worked. But women still were involved in religion. And so what does it mean when you have women who are involved really closely in religion? What does it mean when you have a state religion? When your religion is state regulated, when those two elements are kind of inescapably connected.
Mm.
So what is a citizen is actually a much, much more complicated question, because our understanding of what is a citizen, and caveat, I am talking mostly about Athens in this case because it
Yeah.
is what I've focused on. I know I'm boring.
But isn't Athens also like what we have the most on? Like there is the
It
most to
is.
focus
Yeah.
on.
And that's the
So
other thing. There is a survivorship bias. It's like
yeah,
this is the documentation we've got.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, so what is a citizen? A citizen is someone who participates in politics. Okay, then all men are okay, then men are citizens. That's great.
hmm
But also, religion is political. Religion is state regulated. Religion has to do very strongly with identity. So it's thankfully we have started to move away from the idea of the men had all the power and the women were kind of just there.
hmm
because there was nuance and there was, things that complicated the general picture. And I think that definitely helps as well in when we bring in other elements such as disability, because if we move away from a sort of a universally defined, you know, citizenship equals citizen participation, and citizen participation equals the men going to the law courts and men, you know, being part of the prytanei and of the boule and doing all the work, then that's when you open up the possibility to break that mold. And that's when, you kind of bring to the forefront the voices that maybe haven't been heard that
That's so interesting. I'm totally guilty of this too, of talking about women, especially Athenian, who as if just like they're there unfortunately and have no power. And obviously I do that as I point out that that's bad, but at the same time still totally guilty of assuming that, or just kind of going with that, because I think it is sort of the long-standing idea. But it's so much more interesting to look at it like this and saying that, like, I mean, if anything is obvious about the Athenian world, it's that religion was political. Like, you can see that by just being in Athens today, that like everything kind of revolved around
much.
around the religion. And so that is so much more interesting. And then being able to look at it in terms of women and other people who were not able to participate in the quote unquote traditional idea of politics. I
Exactly.
love that.
Yeah, and I mean, that it's not something that I've focused that much on personally, but something can also be said about enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
And how does shifting the definition of citizen, trying to break the mold of what we define as citizen and what we define as power, help us in elevating and and highlighting voices that may not have been as present. Like, what are our textual ghosts? How do we break the mold of citizen to allow space for those ghosts to come forward?
Yeah.
We're going back to the cemetery. It's all haunted. It's
I
all
mean,
haunted.
I'm writing down the term textual ghost so that I remember it when I'm editing, because that's wonderful.
No, that's exciting. But yeah, no, it's like, not to, it's like, yeah, it's all haunted. What I study is
Yeah.
hauntings in all their various shapes and forms.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, obviously all I want to talk about ever is like, what we do and don't know about the roles of women in ancient Greece, because that is just what fascinates me most of all. But it is so interesting to look at kind of everyone that was on the outside, everyone that wasn't like this, what we had as this traditional idea of Athenian citizenry for so long. um Especially just hearing that they did help monetarily or economically help people who were disabled and couldn't participate but were Athenian. So it seems like in the end what matters most is like, are you Athenian in the traditional, the sprung from the earth kind of sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, but then I feel like it's also important to point out that there is the other side of that, which is like,
Mm.
well, if you weren't
Yeah.
politically, you were left in the dust. I mean, okay. See, I say a statement, and then I'm like, well, actually, no, there's nuance. Rabbit holes,
This is what I
turtles,
say. That this happens to me all the time. That's what statements
turtles,
are.
all the way down. But yeah, so it's like, well, okay, so you have that if you're a citizen, if you're a born
Hmm.
citizen, but what happens when you don't?
Yeah.
And then we get really interesting examples of that as well, because to bring it back to the gravestone, there's another gravestone that I've looked at that's once again about women, and it's once again about the relationship that exists and that builds between women. For example, it's the grave stele of a woman named Melita, and it's made explicit on the grave stele. Two things are made explicit: she is not a citizen, and she took care of children.
Hmm.
And the third thing, which is directly connected to these, is the gravestone is set up either in name or she paid for it, we don't know, by the woman who Melita took care of as a child.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. But it's made abundantly clear that Melita isn't a citizen.
Right.
But her father is a powerful medic. So medics were non-resident non-citizen residence on Athenian soil was powerful enough and had done enough for the city that he didn't need to pay the metoikon tax, which is the residency tax that you had to pay if you weren't a citizen but you still wanted to live in Athens.
Huh.
And so here we have another kind of power, which is economic power. Yes, Melitta's father was precluded from most political power because he wasn't a citizen, but his daughter was important enough that she got her own grave. Was important enough that she got her own grave stele, she got her own inscription, which cost money.
Yeah.
Which means that someone cared for her enough to do those things, even though they weren't part of the traditional sort of power structure of Athenian citizenship, but they had economic power, which is another facet, which is why I think it's really important to kind of always remember that when we're talking about citizenship, when we're talking about power and power dynamics, there are so many different ways in which these manifested and in which these came to the fore.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly important to talk about the alternative too, because I mean, it's not to suggest that Athens was some kind of like dream location for everyone. But that's really fascinating. And of course, it's unsurprising that economic power gets you things even that far back. But yeah, so I mean, and then do we have, I mean, I'm sure it's tough in terms of like actual examples because of the lack of power, but the lives of people who, I mean, I suppose was it common to live in Athens if you weren't a citizen and you didn't have economic power? Like, was that a common occurrence
I
that we
mean,
know of?
I think so.
Mm.
I'm trying to think of things that I've looked at that we can sort of use to talk about that. I mean, we definitely know that there were most wet nurses, for example,
Mm.
weren't citizens. It was a job that was typically considered not a job for citizen women. So it was either enslaved women or metics, non-resident, non-citizen residents.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, there's great book that actually touches on that. I can't remember the author right now, but it's all about sort of it's women in Athens, and in particular non-citizen women in
Mm.
Athens, foreign women in Athens, I think is the title. And yeah, it sort of looks at women who are already kind of underrepresented, understudied at this point, but definitely underrepresented in our sources. And then you sort of take that a step, even lower, and now
Hmm.
you're looking at non-citizen women. So basically no protection, no social safety net that we know of, that we can speak of, other than again, relationships, and other than those relationships that women created and relied on and maintained. It's really interesting. Do you know about Neaira?
No.
Oh, because I feel like she'd be way up your alley.
Okay.
So talking about legal speeches, we have this speech that is, his name, it's pseudo Demosthenes. We know it's not Demosthenes. It's probably this dude named Apollodorus, and he brings this speech to court because one of his political rivals, and it's politics. So one of his political rivals, it turns out that apparently he is married to a non-Athenian woman named Neaira, and what they've done is they've passed their children, or they've passed Neaira's daughter. The paternity isn't clear, and I think it's kept intentionally ambiguous. But they
Hmm.
passed Neaira's daughter off as a citizen. That is the accusation.
Hmm.
And then it devolves into this like really sort of intense and brutal ad hominem attack against Neaira and her daughter Phano, because Neaira used to be a sex worker.
Mm.
And so in the speech is fantastic. It's a great speech. It tells us so much about body politics, about gender politics, about sexuality, about prostitution, what sex work meant, what it represented in Athens. It's often, against Neaira, is often taken in concert with against Timarchus. Also touches on bodily autonomy and bodily integrity and citizenship from a different point of view, which is this young man who was accused of prostituting himself, and that was illegal. He couldn't, if citizens were not allowed to prostitute themselves or be
Hmm.
prostituted. And so Timarchus is accused of doing it, of selling sex in exchange for money, and that precludes him technically from being, that would see him stripped of his citizen status. Whereas with Neaira, it's whole it's similar. She's apparently, according to the story, she's an ex sex worker. She can't be a citizen because it's an oxymoron. You can't be a citizen and be a sex worker. Not only that, but she's married a citizen, which would be fine. It's legal. It's perfectly legal. But this child, who could be her husband's daughter, might be a child of a previous marriage. Even worse, she's presented as a citizen and she participates in the cult. So the big
Mm.
thing is that Fano is allowed to be Basilina, and that's a big no-no. And then there's a few other sordid details about her and Neaira basically trapping Fano's new husband, and trying to coerce him into giving them money. There's a strong assumption that a lot of what is recounted in the speech is fabricated as a way for Apollodorus to get back at Stephanos, who is Neaira's husband.
Hmm.
But the core of the speech is, it's such a fantastic treasure trove of a lot of the different topics we've been touching on, about citizenship and identity and gender and bodies and all those things all mixed up together. I love
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite. I love it. It's a great speech. Highly recommend it.
I'm going to be looking for it. Absolutely. That's really interesting. And so it actually like leads to a few questions I had even before of, so if you marry a non-citizen and you have a child, are they a citizen? It
No,
sounds like yeah. No. Okay, so
no,
they passed her off. So regardless of whether or not she was the daughter of this of
guy.
the
Yeah, Stephanos.
yeah.
No, it's illegal. So per the Periclean
Okay.
citizenship law, a citizen, an Athenian citizen, is someone who is born of two Athenian parents.
Okay. So they have to both be Athenian.
Yes,
Yeah.
they have to both be Athenian. It's not.
Interesting.
It doesn't say grandparents. Interestingly, so it's not like, oh, this person has
Mm.
to be. It can even be an Athenian citizen and someone who was naturalized.
Okay.
But naturalization was very difficult to obtain.
Yeah, so what's the deal with that? 'Cause that also sounds interesting. Like how
Um,
could you be naturalized? How could you officially be a citizen?
Very often it sort of comes back to ideas of time. So you do
Mm.
enough things that are honorable towards the Athenian citizen body,
Mm.
and then you are sort of granted the privilege of becoming an Athenian citizen, with all the
Interesting.
obligations and all the privileges that that entails. So
That's
there
so
is
fascinating.
so there is the possibility of social mobility from a citizenship point of view, but then in actuality it is quite different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a closed system, but it's technically open, but it's also really closed. But it also doesn't. The really important thing is that it's not defined by class.
Right.
So anyone, as long as you are born Athenian, you are a citizen.
Mhm.
So even if, and that's why they have social security, because maintaining that, maintaining that citizenship status, because it's an inherent, it's defined by genetics, quote unquote, then your relationship to the state changes.
Right. So are there a lot of cases then of like people being passed off as Athenian or lying or and getting caught or what have you? I don't know. I mean, that seems so interesting because it is like, like you say, like quote unquote genetics, like you're born into it. It seems to me it'd be something that you'd want to try to lie about if you really wanted it.
Well, that's what the whole Against the IRA is about. It's
Yeah.
about, it's food stamp fraud, or like that's the rhetoric. The more things
Right.
change, the more they stay the same. It's like, oh, they're undocumented people passing themselves off as citizens to defraud
Right.
the system.
Right. That's so true. Even just using that word. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the frustrating things is that we don't know who won in the Against the IRA. We don't know if,
Oh.
yeah, I know, we don't know if Apollodorus was able to convince the jury, or if the jury was like, these people, it's fine, we don't care. And it's like that one piece of the puzzle that I think would tell us so much about what the view of this whole genetic citizenship thing was. It's like, okay, but like from the narrative, from the narrative of the speech, it does sound that like that Stephanos and Neaira were at that point probably in their 40s or 50s. They already had a daughter that was marriageable. And Fano, I think, is married twice, which, doesn't mean much, but there's definitely the impression that you get from the speeches that they've been a well-established part of the community for quite some time. And having the verdict would tell us so much about, like, how much weight did that carry?
Yeah.
Did they say, oh, we've known these people for the last 30 years. We're not gonna, they're part of this community. Did they lie? Did they not? Doesn't matter. They're still important. And I feel like we're
Yeah.
missing that piece, and it's so frustrating because we'll never know. We'll never know. Yeah.
I mean, story of like everything I think about all the time.
Yeah.
Like, what do we not know? Yeah.
So much.
I
So
know
much.
everything.
I mean, not everything, but a lot.
No,
And,
I know. But everything that, like, all the it feels like everything that matters because those are the questions that we have are the things we don't know. And then, so, I mean, I just focus on those things. I'm especially lost art and plays and
oh
just so
boy.
many things.
Yes.
I could think about
No.
it forever.
But I think for me at least, that's part of the charm, part of the fun is like,
Yeah.
back to the sort of textual ghost. It's haunted, and I like it that way. It,
Yeah.
it's like we don't need to. At least for me, it's like we don't need to know everything. Also, because it's like, I don't know, how do I put this? Sometimes I feel like there's this idea that to understand the past we need to know all of it,
Mhm.
but I don't think that's true. I think the only way that we understand the past is by having these gaps that we then put in conversation with our own reality.
Mm.
And that's the only way that we can really know the past, because nothing is certain when we're talking about
Mhm.
memories. Memory is always going to be distorted.
Yeah, all history is subjective and based on who wrote it down and why, and let alone who kept that and why. And that's the thing, yeah. That's what interests me so much as well, is just what do we have, but also like why do we have this? Like how many people had to decide that it was worth
Yes,
keeping for it to
yes.
end up with us.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
It's one. Everything matters. You
Yeah.
decide to save this text, and then this text is going to come down through centuries and centuries and centuries because it mattered to 10 different scribes.
Yeah. Or and then you think of the random things that we know. I mean,
Mm.
obviously primarily archaeological stuff is going to be just it a lot of the time it just happened to survive.
Yep.
But then I think of like Euripides and how I'm grateful every day that like one person collected
Mhm.
Euripides, and that's why we have
Mhm.
so many, and that's just like this wild and random occurrence that we have one person's collection, and that alone is so mind-blowing and fascinating, and just to think of like yeah, I mean, or like Sappho and the way that so much of that has come down and like why it's fragmentary and like it's not that somebody chose to keep it, it's that so much of the time it's that random things survived through completely random like natural intervention almost.
Mhm. But I do think that, like, if one thing that's really sort of become crystal clear for me over the, almost a decade now that I've been studying this stuff, is that, like, all it takes is one person.
Yeah.
As you said with
Yeah.
the Euripides, all it takes is one person, and then we get all that. And it's like, my God, there was anything more that could remind me of just like how important just one single individual is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wish I knew of more examples of the level of randomness that it does exist in that Euripides example because it that one's just truly so incredible to
Yeah,
me.
no, it blows my mind every time I think about it.
Right? Like and I choose to think about it so often cuz I mean, one Euripides is amazing and like I love that we have so many of his, but also that we have so many in like one chunk of the alphabet is so
It's
amazing.
yeah,
I'm like, but what if
yeah.
the whole person's collection survived? Oh, it's it's so. I mean, God, all of this stuff. This is why I definitely do need to do my master's, just if I can like pick some random thing like this and dive more into it myself. But it's also interesting, and so the I'm interested in the mythology behind it. Obviously, I have briefly told the origin story of Athens on the show, but so long ago. I'm so interested in the ideas of like sprung from the earth versus always here. So is there more to do with that? I mean, I know the mythology is like, yeah, it's Erichthonius and his little snakiness kind of. I mean, the best is that he sprung from the earth where Hephaestus,
Yep.
or rather Athena sort of brushed Hephaestus off her. I don't know why I'm tiptoeing around it, but it's just such a bizarre story of like, okay, cool. Hephaestus just jizzed on Athena's leg and she brushed it off, and then thus was born the Athenian people.
Mm-hmm.
But so did they, I mean, that's the sprung from the earth, but then did they, I don't know quite what I'm asking. Is there more to say about the mythology behind it, what they believed, how they saw it on a more personal and like daily life kind of way?
If we look at urban space, there is sort of the ongoing hotly debated of where was Erichthonius? Where was he? Like the iconography of Erichthonius, where was it? There are some people who argue it was on the pediment of the Parthenon. He was definitely present, part of the imagery of autochthony. There's a great paper that talks exactly about this. It's actually the reason why I even started studying this stuff, because that's the paper that really introduced me to the idea of ideology reflects in space. So there was definitely a very, not very strong, but definitely a felt presence of the mythological background that surrounded, the Athenian origin myth.
Yeah.
And this very much codified, legalized mythology that was, part and parcel of the way that Athenians saw themselves.
Do you know where the snakes come in? I mean, I know snakes in general are pretty like important overall mythologically, but it's always been so interesting to me that he's just like, and
Snake
not
legs.
just him, but yeah, like he's just, I think my very early episode of this was called like Snake People of Early Athens, because there's more than just him too, right? Or I know there's like a lot of, there's lack of clarity on like who was first and who came after and
Yeah,
whether
so
there was
there's
one
like,
or two generations, but
there's an ongoing sort of, there's Erichthonius, there's Erichthonius. It's just, they're slightly spelled differently. I sometimes
yeah.
have problems keeping straight who's who.
Because it's like a Erechtheus and Erichthonius, right?
Yeah,
Like it's
Erechtheus,
like an,
Erichthonius.
yeah, and then yeah.
It's
Is this two people?
one
Is
of
it one
them,
person?
two people, one person. One of them has daughters. The daughters are the ones who like
Right.
lift up the blanket and see that Erechtheus or Erichthonius has snake legs, snegs, if you will.
And I will.
Thank you. Excellent. I think that should be the title. None of this textual ghost bullshit.
Snegs.
Snegs. Yeah. So I think it's just because snakes are associated with the underworld
Mm,
and they're
right.
chthonic because they
Right.
go underground, they come back out. Ancient science doesn't really know how things work, so they're like, oh, they die and come back to life every year, and they go underground to hibernate. It's like, sure, fine. But
I love ancient science.
it's great. It's like this happened to me in a dream. Elaborate. No. Yeah, basically. And so I think it's just because snakes are underground chthonic.
Right.
And
no, it makes sense. Yeah, just they come from the earth in the same way, so that's like kind of the human connecting it with something from the earth and sort of humanity.
Yeah, I think it's just that.
I like it. I'm not a snake person, but somehow mythology has made me one. So as long as the snake is not real, then I'm here for it.
Oh, are they too creepy crawly?
They're like the thing for me. Like
Interesting.
like the physical reaction no matter what of like, ugh. Meanwhile, I like love sharks to the ends of the earth. Like it's not about them being scary, it's like the physicality of
hilarious.
snakes.
Because for me, the animal, total tangent, but for me, the animal that's like, is sloth.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. Yes. I love that.
I just can't look at them. They freak me out. They freak me the fuck out. I'm like, no, stop. I think because they go slightly into the uncanny valley for me.
Oh, totally. I can see that. Yeah.
I like look at them and I'm like, you almost look like a person, and that unsettles me.
Yeah, no, that snakes are my like, no matter what. I don't know why. Oh, it's also interesting. So what I'm trying to think of more ways to keep you talking, basically, if you have more to share.
Because like we've gone into so many different really exciting, interesting directions. which is great because I think it really captures the fact that like people are like, so what do you study? And I'm like, do you have an hour and a half in which I can explain to you all of the ways in which my little ADHD brain has connected everything that I study, even though it's 25 different topics.
I love that though. I mean, and I think it connects so well. And these are such interesting things about Athens and sort of connect with the idea that we know so much more about Athens than so many other places,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which
yeah,
of has its like dark sides of it's too bad that we don't know more about elsewhere because of like sort of
yeah.
an Athenian bias. But I'm glad that we know so much about life in Athens in that way, right? Like,
Yeah, no, I mean it's true. I mean we haven't even touched on like the whole other side of the disability stuff, which is votive objects and
mm.
like more embodiment stuff. So, and in particular, so
Oh yeah, Asclepius was on your when you filled out my form. Thank
yeah,
you
the
for reminding me.
forms.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So the other thing that connects to inscriptions that so and this is a bit outside of Athens.
Mm.
It happened in Athens as well, but so we have these very big healing sanctuaries. We have the Asclepiae, and a big thing at the Asclepiae, especially at Epidaurus, is that there are inscriptions, and these inscriptions talk about are written or dictated or produced by very often they're produced by disabled and or impaired people who are talking about their illnesses, and more
Hmm.
often than not, they are talking about how the god came down and in a dream healed them. There's a lot of theories about what the stream actually was. We can't. I won't go into it because it's very hotly debated, and a lot of people just discuss it. And it's. I think it's one of those things that we're never going to be able to explain.
Yeah.
Like all we know is that these people fell asleep and woke up and they were cured. Whether this
Yeah.
meant they were knocked out and surgery was performed on, rudimentary surgery was performed on them, or they got so high, or they just it was just a whole placebo effect. We'll never know. We will not know
Yeah.
because these stories are inherently mythologized.
Yeah.
But what I find so interesting is, well, two things. One is these are the closest, I think, other than Lysias, which is, I wouldn't call it a first person narrative. None of these can be defined first person narratives the way that we would define them. This isn't sick or disabled or temporarily disabled people telling their story. These are stories that have been filtered nonetheless through, whoever was inscribing, through
Mhm.
whoever wrote the speeches. These aren't, but I think these inscriptions in particular are the closest we can get to a
Mhm.
first person narrative of disability. And in connection to those, we also have votive objects. And what those are is very often you'll have body parts and
I
models of body
love
parts,
that.
and I love them. They're
Yeah.
fantastic. They
I've
are
talked about them on the show before
wonderful.
because they blow my mind. I just think it's so cool. Like I take my sweet time in that Acropolis Museum every time because they've got so much on it on that lowest level, and you're just like, wow, like the things like here's just an ear because I really needed like my ear infection cured or something.
Yeah,
It's yeah, it's
yeah.
so lovely.
And they've been often read as sort of this idea that the body in illness is fragmented, and so that this is a
Mm.
way of reconciling that. And I don't think so. So I think that reading that sort of inherently views disability as wrong or unfortunate. There's this reading of this, like the idea that like, oh, disability, it was so terrible, such a horrible thing to have that they had to find a way to reconcile their fragmented body. And I think that there's a much
Huh.
more nuanced way of reading them, and that sort of
Yeah.
comes back to the whole idea of like, okay, what happens if we read these as first person or as close as we can get to that first person narratives of disability? What does it mean to embodiment theory if we're saying, well, and then we can start looking at more recent stuff, and that's where the intersection comes, and that's where the connection to the present comes into play so strongly for me. I think is okay, what about modern day prosthetics?
Mhm.
What's a prosthetics where what is their relationship to their body? How can we draw parallels between those and these ancient votives? And then we have these inscriptions that talk about I came to the temple because I had this ailment, and then I fell asleep and the god cured me. And then I woke up
Mhm.
and I went home and I was fine. What does that tell us about illness and impairment? And I think also one of the pitfalls that we often encounter when talking about disability is that in our modern view of disability, it is so polarized. It's either
Mm-hmm.
you're ill or you're not. There is no spectrum, even though it should be a spectrum. I think it's because we, in our modern view disability as such a polarized. Either you're sick or you're not. You're disabled or you're not.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to always keep, I think, in the back of our minds when talking about ancient disability that they didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have splints, they didn't have X-rays, they didn't have casts. Well, they had splints, they didn't have casts.
Mm.
But it's disability was so much more present. I think
Yeah.
so much more commonplace. So much less medicalized in the sense that we medicalize disability and impairment. That I think that talking about fragmentary identity in the face of illness doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think like it's probably like I think any term I'm going to use is going to not can really convey the point, but like it's more so a sort of what do I want to say? It seems more like a sort of just daily life kind of occurrence in a way that like obviously it is now as well, but we see it differently
Yeah,
because of what everything you're saying, right? And but otherwise it's just sort of like no, I mean you're going to see a lot of people who have varying types of issues and disabilities, illnesses, what have you, because like you're saying there it wasn't you didn't just go off and get cured in whatever way, or it was just sort of like life in a sort I want to say normal, but obviously not to suggest that anything's abnormal, but it just seems like it was probably a more normal thing in
normalized.
their world. Yeah, normal life to have whatever you have kind of going on.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I think
yeah.
it was. I mean, just practically speaking, it was just much more normalized.
Hmm.
Which I think is always important to keep in mind that different relationships to medicine, different medicine, like non-modernized medicine, non-westernized medicine as well,
Mm-hmm.
has given us such a specific view of illness and health, polarized, inherently opposite, whereas, it always has been a spectrum. And it was even more so in the past when the distinction between the two was so much less stark.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. Has been so much fun. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. I mean, it was such an exciting surprise when I saw your email in my inbox. I was like, ah. Also, because like so many scholars that I admire have been on your podcast, and I was
That's
like,
so
but I'm
exciting to
just
me.
this little old me. But yeah, no, this has been so much fun.
Oh, I'm so glad. And honestly, like I love when everybody though reaches out about being on it. Like I'm really hesitant to ever reach out to people because I don't want them to feel bad if they don't want to be on the show. So I love
Mm,
my form where I can kind of solicit it from others
yeah,
and then
yeah, yeah, yeah.
get an idea of like what you want to talk about and all that. So
No,
thank
yeah,
you for
absolutely.
filling it out. But is there anything you want to share with my listeners or anywhere you want them to follow you to learn more or what have
Yes.
you?
Um, I am on the bird, as many of us are. Yeah. So it's just at Justin Biggi, Biggi. I'm terrible at it. I go dormant for months and weeks, and then I'm
I
like,
was gonna
hello.
say. Yeah, I haven't seen you on there in ages.
I'm just bad at it. Social media is a lot. I'm deep down in the depths of my heart. I am a cantankerous old man.
I
And I'm
truly
like,
wish I was better at avoiding it. Like I'm envious. So
I just have terrible object permanence. So I uninstalled the app from my phone, and now it's like every once in a while I'm like, oh yeah, shoot, Twitter, huh. But I'm hoping also because I am technically taking a bit of a sabbatical from academia, and that is all academia all of the time. I
Mm.
suspect I will definitely become more active on it when I am once more in the trenches.
Well, it's wonderful, and then we'll be able to learn more about what you're studying then.
Yeah,
So that
but
sounds
yeah, no, this
great.
was fantastic.
Nerds, nerds, nerds. Thank you, as always. And again, as always, it is the coolest thing in the goddamn world that you all love to listen to me talk with scholars and authors and academics and anyone who has this level of nerdy knowledge to share. It's such a thrill, particularly when we get to talk and learn about issues like disability in the ancient world, issues that were just as important then as they are now, but are just now being really studied and understood on a wider scale. Like, I fucking love when people can come on and share this kind of knowledge. So again, huge thank you to Justin for joining me, and huge thank you to you all for listening. What a cool job I have. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians and handles so many podcast-related things. She's a dream. Grace Roby is our intern. Stephanie Foley works to transcribe the podcast for YouTube captions and accessibility. The podcast is hosted and monetized by Acast. I am Liv, and I love this shit.